Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to this afternoon's presentation on Pinellas County, Florida's native ferns. We're a little off schedule. We got delayed last week, of course, because we had the threat of some serious weather happening by. So nice to see that you joined us on this rescheduled date. My name is James Stevenson, and I'm coming to you from the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, the Extension Services here in Pinellas County, Florida. Physically, I'm sitting in Brooker Creek Preserve. We're a 9,000-acre preserve here in the north of Pinellas County, where you can find all of the ferns that we'll be looking at today. This interesting group of plants that we're going to explore can be found on our 9,000-acre, 50% wetland, 50% upland. So all the freshwater ecosystems are represented here at Brooker Creek, where this fascinating group of plants lives. A lot of the information that hasn't come from direct personal experience can be found in this book called The Ferns of Florida. Now, we don't make any money selling this book. I'm just presenting it to you as this is all we got. A lot of people enjoy reading this book because of its very familiar, kind of chatty way that it is written by the author Gil Nelson, who is an expert in Florida flora. This one condenses this one particular group of plants down into just one book. Now, this book is getting to be a little long in the tooth, and as we learn more about plants, as we learn more about their relationships, their evolutionary histories, of course, the inevitable name changes happen. So some, maybe a lot of names that are published in this book from over more than 10 years ago might be slightly different now. The information about the plants is the same, but the names may have been a little bit rearranged. So just a little bit of a little caveat there. A lot of the photographs in today's presentation come from the Atlas of Florida Vascular Plants. This has been set up by the University of South Florida, where the herbarium is located, run by Wonderland, Hansen, and Frank currently. And this is a great clearinghouse of distribution of all the species of plants that have ever been found growing in Florida, not cultivated, but having come up on their own. So this gives data on the distribution, the status, threatened, endangered, invasive. All these kind of categories are all found in the Atlas of Florida Vascular Plants, so definitely worth checking out. Today, in this next hour, what I'm hoping to achieve with this group is to get an overall view of what a fern is, and what makes a fern, the biology of ferns. We'll do that through exposing you to some fern terminology, the vocabulary of the discipline of plant identification as it applies to ferns. We'll think about and look at some identification techniques. What is it that you need to be looking for if you're trying to identify perhaps an unknown species of fern? And then we'll just go through a list of the 15 fern species that are found here at Brooker Creek Preserve that you can actually come and visit and see for yourself what makes one different from another and what makes them similar. So that's how we'll go about this today. And it's broken into these sections. What is a fern? The vocabulary. We'll look at fronds, because really there aren't that many parts to a fern. There's not that much to be different from one specimen to another. So it oftentimes comes down to what the leaf itself looks like. And in ferns and in certain other plant groups, those leaves are referred to as fronds. We'll do some quick identification and then take a look at the ferns of Brooker Creek, which basically is the ferns of Pinellas County. So what is a fern? You've probably heard the word fern, know that it's a plant. Know that it probably has leaves that are fern-like, divided into these smaller segments, these smaller little leaflets. But scientifically, ferns fit into a nice, discrete little category within the entire kingdom of the group of organisms that we know as plants, based on their reproduction and their morphological complexity. They have a common ancestor that bestowed that type of reproduction and that physiological complexity onto, therefore, all of the offspring that have diversified into the group of plants that today we know as ferns. When we take a look at the kingdom of plants writ large, they're broken down into these nice little discrete bundles. The very first of the land plants are represented by plants with no plumbing, no vascular system, no roots, no stems, no leaves, basically just kind of membranous stacks of membranes, perhaps. Very, very simple body structure, reproducing by spores. Today, those are represented by their lineage referred to as the mosses. Perhaps you've heard of mosses, not the stuff that's in the trees, but these very low growing, non-vascular green plants, the mosses. There are others called liverworts and quillworts and hornworts. You don't really get to see them much because they don't have the vascular system that gets them up and off the ground. They need to grow very close to the ground and kind of cryptically. So that's one group of plants. And then we get to the one that we're studying today, a little bit more complex. The vascular system has evolved, still reproducing by spores. So vascular, spore producing, that combination of characteristics presents us with this group that we'll look at today, the ferns. And if you're familiar with horsetails or scouring rush, those are actually a type of fern because of their vascular system and the way that they reproduce. All the other plants belong to basically two more groups. The conifers, those plants that reproduce, that bear seeds, actual seeds, not spores, but seeds in cones. And then there's the biggest group of all, the flowering plants. So we have these nice four discrete bundles, the mosses, the ferns, the conifers, and the flowering plants. Today, we're going to look at this one group, vascular system reproducing by spores. The life cycle, when I talk about reproduction, this life cycle belongs to the ferns. This is what makes ferns ferns. They have this weird life cycle where they produce spores. And if you see the photograph behind me is the underside of one of our native ferns. And the spores are produced by the millions on these little areas on the underside of the leaf. Each one of those areas contains these little containers that are full of seeds. The seeds drift out, germinate, grow into a separate plant that then has to mix up the sperm and the eggs to grow into the fern that you see behind us. It's an alternation of generations, and it's what makes ferns ferns. If you were asked to draw a fern from memory, just draw me a fern. Just sketch me a fern. You might draw something like this. And if you did, you'd be a much better artist than me, but you get what I'm saying. You would draw this leaf that's divided and maybe wavy and, separated into these little individual leaflets. But ferns can be a little bit more complicated than that as far as their morphology. Here's a photograph of two different kinds of fern that couldn't be any less fern-like. These are both aquatic. These both float on the surface of the water. These are both often referred to as duckweed, even though they're not. They're ferns. They're not flowering plants. They're ferns. The one with the little scaly leaves here is called Azola, or Mosquito Fern, and the larger one is called water spangles. But because they're vascular and they reproduce by spores, and those spores are contained in a special little structure, they get to be ferns. Other plants look like ferns, but they're not. The asparagus fern is the classic example of that. It even has fern in its common name, but its genus name, asparagus, gives you the clue, the hint, the fact that this does belong to a group of flowering plants known as the asparagus. Asparagus being flowering plants. Remember, mosses, ferns, conifers, and flowering plants, the asparagus is a flowering plant. Just because the leaf is ferny doesn't make it a fern. The fact that it reproduces using flowers means that it cannot be a fern. It's actually a flowering plant in the genus Asparagus. Stay with me? Okay. Let's have a look at some fern words, words that are associated with fern botany, maybe not unique to fern botany, but associated with fern botany, like the word frond. The leaf of a fern is most of the time referred to as the frond. And when we look at a typical fern frond, that frond can be subdivided into individual parts. The fern is composed of the blade, which is the part where the photosynthetic tissue, the leaf tissue, is located on the blade. The little bit of stem-like tissue that holds the blade up in the air. Here we go from the underground stem running up to the very first of these little leaflets. That section is called the petiole. The blade is very often subdivided into these little individual leaf units, one blade divided into these tiny little units. The units referred to as pinnae, singular pinna, like feather. This is pinna, pinnae, and rachis, that bit of stem or that bit of frond architecture that runs through and supports those leaflets. It's referred to as the rachis. So pinna, pinnae, rachis, those are all words that are also associated with feather architecture. So early scientists saw similarities between the fern blade, the fern frond, and the feather, and borrowed the terminology from that. So frond and blade and stem, this underground stem where each of the individual leaves or blade or fronds is produced, and roots, those are all pretty common, easy to understand words. A little bit more heavy duty when we start talking about this idea of a petiole and the rachis and the pinnae and the pinna, singular. But when you're identifying ferns, when you're collecting information about trying to get to an identification about ferns, this is the vocabulary that you'll be asked questions about. What is the length, breadth, width, color of the rachis? So you could look that up in your glossary and go right to that part of the plant so you can answer questions about that. Is the blade divided into individual pinnae? So you would then, in your mind or using a glossary, go to the blade and figure out the pinna. This is kind of a typical fern frond with the petiole, the rachis, and the blade itself being divided into these little tiny leaflets. But sometimes the blade is not divided into little leaflets. Sometimes it's referred to as a simple blade. So we have the petiole and the rachis and just a unbroken surface of photosynthetic tissue like you would find in the bird's nest ferns. We don't have these at Brooker. We had to go over to Hillsborough River State Park to take a picture of this native fern. But here we have a fern with an undivided blade. The blade of the frond of this fern is undivided. Next to it, the swamp fern, that blade is divided into these little leaflets, if you see them off to the side. So here we have an entire blade undivided in the bird's nest fern. The way that's referred to is a simple blade versus the compound blade. So this is just one fern leaf here. It's just one leaf, but it's been divided into these tiny little bits. And those tiny little bits are called pinna. Okay, that's a compound frond. So simple and compound. Compound is the more usual. And as I said before, pinna, word borrowed from zoology. It means feather. This setup is referred to as a pinnate, like a feather. It's pinnate, a pinnate frond, or it's pinnately compound. So the frond, the blade of the frond is pinnately compound. It's one leaf that's been divided into these little tiny bits. Ferns have a good way, have a propensity to chop things into much smaller pieces, where that one blade can be divided twice. So we have right here the overall blade of this imaginary frond, and it's been divided into these units, which come off of the rachis, and then those units themselves have smaller little subdivisions. So that's twice compound or bipinnate. You don't need to memorize this stuff. Just hear the word for the first time so that when you're studying ferns and they come up again, you will say, oh yeah, I have heard this before. Ferns, just because, might even divide their blade 3 times in a condition that is referred to as tripinnate. So again, if you follow the glowing laser pointer, I'm outlining the blade of this imaginary fern, and the rachis has one branch here. That branch is separated into smaller branches, and each one of the smaller branches bears the photosynthetic tissue. So that's divided 3 times. That's tripinnate. I'm just telling you, as I mentioned, this is just information that I'm presenting to you. It's not my fault that it's like this. It's just the way it is, and there are words for it. And finally, I won't go any further into the 4 times pinnate, the 5 times pinnate, and so on. But I do need to call attention to a leaf, a fern frond setup that is referred to as pinnatifid. It would be pinnate, but it isn't. If it had only become divided into discrete little leaflets, pinnatifid just means really, really deeply lobed. And that's the condition of the resurrection fern, very common fern on our live oak trees. And here we have the blade of a real resurrection fern. But if we trace the outline of the blade, you'll see that it's just very deeply lobed. It never reaches the rachis, and these individual segments never really become independent of one another. So it's not considered a compound frond. Okay? Oh, there is one more thing. To be infuriating, a frond can be both at the same time. A frond can be pinnate, pinnatifid. So we have a frond that's pinnate, so we have the rachis of a single leaf. That leaf is then divided And then those divisions are pinnatifid. So we have a pinnate, pinnatifid frond. Again, you don't need to memorize this. Just need to say it out loud so that as you pursue your interest in ferns, you will have heard these words before. And when you read about them again in the glossary, it won't be for the first time. You've seen, you've heard. Let's move on. Fern life cycle. Remember, what makes a fern is their vascularization and the way that they reproduce. And that brings us to the life cycle. Very often, most often, not always, but most often, on the underside of the fern frond are found the reproductive structures, physically attached to the frond, physically attached to the leaf. On the underside, because that's the safest side, and it's also, it won't interfere with photosynthesis under there, protected from the rain, the weather, the UV radiation, doesn't interfere with photosynthesis. It just made sense that that was the best place to put the reproductive structures, on the underside of the frond. And what you're looking at here are not spores. You've all seen, I hope, the underside of a fern. You've all seen these structures kind of appear out of nowhere. At the extension office in Largo, people bring in their fern fronds. They say, look, there's all these bugs. They're all lined up very regularly in very neat little lines under. No, no, no. That's the reproductive structures, but these are not the spores. Each one of these little capsules, some of them are dark brown, some of them are pale because they've emptied of their cargo. There's an empty one there. It's just a shell. Each one of these little spheres contains the spores. Let me zoom in a little bit more on one of these collections, one of these clusters of the spore-bearing structures. And here, this is actually a close-up of just one of these on the underside of the golden-foot polypotie. You see these behind me, that one dot magnified looks like this. So it's composed of all these little tiny structures. Each one of these with the funny zipper that runs right down the middle, each one of those contains about 36 spores. So each one of those little spheres has got 36 spores inside. Gives you an idea of how small spores are. They're single cells. Spores are single cells that are capable of germinating and dividing and growing into another organism. In the case of ferns, we have the group of spore-bearing tissue here. Each one of those, what are called sporangia. So let's just take one of those there and blow it up. There's the zipper. Opening up in a special place where the cells are particularly thin, allowing that thing to open up. Come back, pointer. Allowing it to open up and the spores are released. The spore, the single cell, then germinates, divides, and grows into a separate plant, a different plant. It's still part of the same species life cycle. It's just a different plant. It's a different plant that produces different cells. It produces little sperm cells and little egg cells. Sound familiar? Birds, bees, ferns, the whole thing. So this separate plant produces sperm and eggs, sends them out into the world on a thin layer of rainwater. Magically, they find each other. And once the sperm and the egg unite, they form the zygote that then grows into the very large fern that we recognize. And then that fern produces the spore-bearing tissues to start this all over again. It's called an alternation of generations. You've got the fern that we see that produces the spores. That's called the sporophyte generation. The spores then land on the ground and grow into the gametophyte. Separate plant produces gametes. When the gametes unite, they form a zygote that grows into the next sporophyte. Alternation of generations. Sounds weird, but it's old. Old, 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 old. Ferns had this figured out way before the flowering plants were even a thought. Here's an up close of the Sporangium. I mentioned those very weak little cells that can pop apart and kind of cough out the spores into the air. Remember, there weren't any animals. There were no animals around. There were no insects. There were no nothing when ferns were getting their cells worked out, when they moved up onto land and started to reproduce. All they had was the wind and the rain. So everything had to be facilitated by wind and rain. There's no insect fern interactions because the insects had a long way to go before they had even shown up. Here's an up close of what the fern spore grows into, this thing called a Prothalis. At this point, it's almost impossible to identify what species of fern this thing came from. This is just a germinated general fern spore is going to grow into this Prothalis. It's not until this thing produces egg and sperm, and that egg and sperm unite and form the zygote that forms the next sporophyte. Is that species able to be identified? You'd have to be really, really good. In fact, I think it's impossible to identify a species of fern from the Prothalis, from the germinated spore. And they're small. This thing's only about half the size of your pinky nail. You know, very, very small, only a few cell layers thick. They just exist to produce those little structures, the antheridia, that make sperm cells that release them into the environment, egg cells that stay put inside a structure called an archegonia. The sperm from one of the prothali swims over to another prothali, finds the archegonia, swims down into the archegonia, fertilizes the egg cell, and then the sporophyte can grow. Once that sperm has swum down into the archegonia, this is what happens. We have the Prothalis down here, this thin little layer of tissue, and the zygote is actually physically growing out of it. It's a separate plant. Remember, it's the fertilized egg is growing into the separate plant. It's growing out of that little Prothalis. And as I mentioned, they're small. Here we have the sporophyte, sporling, growing up out of the remnants of the gametophyte. This thing's just going to wither away. Its job is done. It's not contributing anything more to the equation. The sporophyte's going to grow and eventually produce spores of its own. So Fern Frond, simple, divided, pinnate, pinnatifid, sporangia, all these words. How do we use those crazy words to identify ferns? Because what we really want to do is figure out what they are, right? Well, it could be the shape, the positioning of those reproductive structures. What we're looking at here is the underside of the invasive tuberous sword fern. And if we take just a second and use some of our words that we've already looked at, we have the rachis. You see this bit of stem that supports the individual little pinna. Each leaflet, the frond blade is divided into these leaflets, and in ferns, they're called pinna. Each one of these has a leaf base that overlaps that rachis a little bit. Do you see that? See how as we move up, you barely can see the rachis anymore. So each one of these little leaflets, these pinna, are lobed in such a way that they overlap the rachis. If you look even more closely, the rachis is covered in these little blonde hairs, diagnostic. So overlapping pinna base, hairy rachis. The individual clusters of sporangia are kind of kidney shaped. Do you see that? See how they're shaped kind of like commas or kidneys? You see how they're spaced along the stem? You think you could count maybe the number of these little areas of sporangia, that might be telling. So these are characters that we can gather. These are characteristics of this particular species, which combined together can lead us to a proper identification of the species. Now, of course, there's more words, so we'll introduce them now. That spot, each individual spot, this one, this one, this one, those are considered to be, each one is a sorus, S-O-R-U-S. The collection of sporangia, one spot of sporangia is called a sorus. Together, they are referred to as the sori. So a botanical description would say something like, the sori are arranged along the edge of the pinna, or the sori are arranged along the midrib of the pinna, if these things were lined up along here. So the positioning of these structures can be quite diagnostic as well. Now, each one of these spots that bears the sporangia, the spore-bearing tissues, they may be covered by this protective little skin. Let me zoom in on that a little bit. That protective little layer, when the sporangia are developing and those precious little spores are being produced, there's this protective flap. That might be present or absent. If it's present, it is referred to as the indusium. The indusium can have a size, a shape, a color, a texture. So the indusium, another word, another part of the frond that can be used in identification. We talked about those sporangia coughing out their spores. Sporangia, they're pretty much the same. So thankfully, you're not going to need a microscope most times to identify ferns. If a plant has these sporangia on the underside of the leaf, you know it's a fern. You don't have to worry about the part of the book that talks about conifers or flowering plants. You know if there's a sporangia that it's and a leaf, then it's a fern. But as I said, all those characters together, look at these sporangia are black. And the indusium is huge and it's round, and the placement of these individual sori, very telling. They abut one another. So this is a fern that doesn't grow here in Florida, but it's quite useful in illustrating the ways that some of these parts whose names we've been looking at can be used diagnostically. Round, indusium present, indusium is green, sporangia black. You can see the little pinna here has a toothy margin. That could be quite diagnostic as well. So even though the ferns share a lot of similarities, and there's not a whole lot that can make them different from one another, they've done the best they can, and they've modified into these species that have collections of characters that make them unique species unto themselves. So just a little bit of recall. Here is a close-up of one of these, actually the very plant. We took a picture of this golden foot polypotie from below, showing those spots. Each one of those spots, when we zoom in, is called, each one of those spots is called a sori together. No, each one of those spots is a sorus. Latin, please. Together they are the sori. A sorus, up close, looks like this. And it's a collection of sporangia, each one of these containing 36 spores. Okay? Sorus, sporangia inside the spores. The place where they're positioned on the underside of the leaf can be diagnostic. Whether or not they have an indusium, one of those coverings, can be diagnostic. The color, in this case, the Lygodium, the golden foot polypotie, the sori are actually gold themselves. They read as gold as you glance at the frond in the field. It's sometimes even possible to determine characteristics of those reproductive structures even when they haven't matured yet. Here we have on the left matured sporangia in their locations, in their sori, their collections, and here an immature leaf, but you can see where they are going to develop. So as with any plant identification, you don't always have all the characters of the unknown specimen at the same time, but you can very often infer. You can find an older leaf, you can find a younger leaf, and you can infer how it is eventually going to develop. Here we have the positioning of the reproductive structures very uniquely right down the middle of the central vein of an individual pinna. So here we have the rachis of this frond, and here we have the leaflet in ferns referred to as a pinna. And the sporangia, they're not in discrete little sori. They're just unbroken collection here of the individual sporangia lined up in a huge mass along the mid vein of an individual pinna. So that's quite diagnostic, and only one fern in Florida does this. The swamp fern. You flip over a fern leaf that could be any fern leaf in the world, and you see this arrangement. You've got the swamp fern. Opposite that, the bracken fern produces its sporangia way out here on the edge of the individual little leaflets, the individual little pinna. You can see those little round structures. Each one of those, of course, is the sporangium with the 64, 34, 36, 64 diagnostic, but thank goodness you don't have to count spores. Here we have the sporangia right around the edge there. So if you have a fern that's growing in the upland, up in the dry sand, bright, sunny with the pines, and it has its sporangia produced right here along the edges, it could only be one Florida fern, and that is the bracken fern. Some ferns have sterile fronds that don't produce any reproductive structures at all, ever, and fertile fronds. So two different shaped leaves. One sterile that does nothing but photosynthesize and feed the rest of the plant, and the other that has given itself completely over to the production of the reproductive structures, the sporangia. And that's the case in the netted chain fern. So here we have the sterile fronds reaching out horizontally to make use of exposure to sunlight. So lying out helps expose yourself to the most sunlight. And then special fronds that are very, very upright, very, very reduced. They don't have a lot of surface area, but packed all along what surface area there is are the sporangia. And these are held way up above the sterile fronds so they can release their spores into the air, into the wind, into the breeze, send their spores far and wide to repopulate and make more netted chain ferns. So this is a scheme in some fern species where two different leaf types are produced by the same plant, sterile for photosynthesis and fertile for reproduction. This is also done in the cinnamon fern. The same plant produces sterile fronds that look very ferny, right? Very ferny frond there. And then special fertile fronds that are hyper-reduced fronds whose pinna or leaflets are nothing more than crowded up, clustered up sporangia. with a kind of characteristic cinnamon golden brown color, giving them their name, the cinnamon fern. It's not where cinnamon comes from, it just happens to have that color. And the fertile fronds come right up out of the center, the entire frond given over to that reproduction. And in some species, they have sterile fronds and fertile fronds that look altogether the same until you turn them over. So identical from the above and then underneath. The only way that you know that it's a fertile frond is if in the presence of, if it has the sporangia, whereas the sterile fronds do not. That's the case in our giant leather fern, where they have these huge fronds, 6 foot fronds, huge. They're divided into pinna, but the pinna are as big as, you know, what is that? An egg beater? I don't know what that is, something that big. Some fertile, some sterile. Ferns also have a really interesting way of growing. They have this uncurling habit. It's called cercinate vernation. You don't have to write that down. You probably didn't even understand what I said. But there's a term for the way that ferns uncurl. It's very, very cool. I don't know. It's just neat. Fiddleheads. You know, some people eat fern fiddleheads. It's not always the best idea, but it can be done. Moving on. Let's take a look at the ferns of Pinellas to finish up. Again, these are the ferns that have been found at Brooker Creek Preserve. Here's a list of the scientific names and the much more approachable, common names. And we'll do this in alphabetical order scientifically. So we'll just have a look in no particular order other than alpha by genus, the different ferns that you can find here in Pinellas County. After I take a quick drink. The giant leather fern is quite an exciting find. It's not found very many places in Pinellas County. It likes to have its feet wet. It's really, really one of these primordial looking plants. As I mentioned before, the individual frond can get to be 6 feet or more. This, we took a picture at John Chestnut, a great place to go and see ferns, John Chestnut up here in North Pinellas. This handrail is about 10 feet from the ground. So from this handrail to where the roots of this giant leather fern are situated is about 10 feet. So you can see the fronds are going much higher than that. So this is a particularly large specimen of the giant leather fern, Acrosticum denifolium. And you maybe can just see the brown on the underside of the fronds here, indicating that this is a fertile frond, that it has the underside of the frond completely covered in sporangia. They're not bundled into sori, are they? They're not bundled into spots called sori. They're just a complete fertile surface. We met earlier the little mosquito fern that kind of flies in the face of what a fern looks like. This is a floating fern, an aquatic fern. Very fascinating, ancient plant. It's been around forever. It probably caused an ice age by taking all the carbon dioxide out of the air, which plants do. There was so much mosquito fern at one point in the Earth's history that it took all the carbon dioxide out of the system, and that cooled everything down so much that we had an ice age. So the mosquito fern, still around today, still up to its old tricks, actually has a captive bacteria that it lives with that can take atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into food for itself. So this is a plant that you'll find growing in stagnant water. Again, a lot of people call it duckweed, although it's not related to what really is duckweed, just because it's a small-leaved floating plant. This is the one that turns red in the summer, bright red. So it might look like a putting green when it's completely covered a stagnant body of water, and then suddenly that putting green turns red. You're probably looking at this little mosquito fern. It's native, it's not invasive, it's ancient, it's found everywhere. It predates the breakup of the one continent into all the other ones. So it was sitting there on the continent when it broke up into all the tiny little continents that we have today. We mentioned the swamp fern before, has had a name change from blechnum to talmatoblechnum. Leave that aside. What's descriptive here is the specific epithet cerulatum. Cerulate, serrated. Serrated refers to the edges of the pinna, which, if you run your finger along the side, feel like that steak knife. It's serrated, it's toothed like a steak knife. Also diagnostic, this is the only one in Florida that puts all the sporangia right along a line in the middle of the pinna. So it also has a very distinctive terminal pinna. So this one blade is divided into the little individual pinna, but the one at the very tip kind of stands out. It's kind of prominent, almost as though it's making some sort of gesture, the swamp fern. Lygodium is the genus name for the Japanese climbing fern. I've got the big red slash here. This is a category 1, which means the worst invasive species. This is one that was grown as a curiosity because who's heard of a climbing fern? How neat. Let's grow it. It, through the wind carrying the spores, found no competition, nothing to stop it, nothing to control it, nothing to eat it. And it became a nuisance and has grown and spread throughout the Southeast and is now currently found in all of these states and territories. Can cause quite a lot of damage by shading out, by suffocating, basically, suffocating trees from sunlight, preventing sunlight from reaching the leaves and killing the trees underneath. The fact that it climbs, so if you have a climbing plant, you flip the leaves over and you see sporangia, it's a fern, it's climbing, it's a climbing fern, it's got to go. Again, the little individual pinna are lobed more like a hand than like a feather. So that's kind of an interesting thing too. If you see this one, if it's in your sphere of influence, get rid of it. Also, the tuberous sword fern. We saw this one earlier. You flip the frond over. It's got the overlapping pinna leaf bases, so you can't see the rachis. If you were to see the rachis, it would have those blonde hairs on it. And if you were to pull up a few of them, you would probably find the tubers that give this thing its common name, the tuberous sword fern. This is one that also needs to be eliminated if it's in your sphere of influence. It's disrupting our native plant communities. It's causing problems. It can even cause a health issue by building up biomass that could carry fire into places where it doesn't belong. Again, we have the overlapping leaf bases, those crescent-shaped sori. Those are both diagnostic of the tuberous sword fern that needs elimination from your sphere of influence. Back to native ferns, the cinnamon fern. We looked at this one earlier. It has the sterile fronds with the fronds that are very ferny, right? And the fertile fronds that are the color of cinnamon. And here we have a plant growing without any fertile fronds just yet. So it is just made up of these sterile fronds. And later on in the season, it produces the special fertile fronds that are nothing more than the grouped up sporangia. So how do you tell a cinnamon fern in the absence of this fertile frond? How do you know if you were to walk up to this that it was a cinnamon fern? Well, we've noticed that if you flip over a sterile frond of this fern, number one, it's pinnate pinnatifid. So we have the rachis divided into this subunit, and the subunit is pinnatifid. Look at that. It's just very deeply lobed. It doesn't actually break off into individual little units. It's just really deeply lobed. So it's pinnatifid. The veins are shaped like tuning forks. You notice that? And it has this little tuft of hair. We call it hairy armpits on the cinnamon fern. So there's a couple of characters that can help you identify a cinnamon fern in the absence of those cinnamon sticks or cinnamon fertile fronds, as it were. It has a cousin, the royal fern. This one is an osmunda. Only the top third of the fertile frond is converted into the fertile bit. Only the top third are the individual pinna, non-photosynthetic. They just have all these sporangia crowded onto them. Also, the individual pinna are very widely spaced apart, and they're quite large. That's allegedly what gives it its royal stature, the size and the spacing of those leaflets. Here it is from a slight distance. You can see the top third of this frond, the fertile frond being kind of a smoky, mauvey, tan color, and the very widely spaced pinnules, very large royal fern. The golden-foot polypotie, like the one you saw behind me, like the one we looked at an up close of an individual story with a very golden sporangia with the 36 or 64 spores inside. No indusium covering those, no little flap covering their story. Here it is in its favorite habitat, the golden-foot polypotie, living in the boots or the leaf bases of a cabbage palm. They just love it up there. Their little Prothalis germinate up there, their spores germinate up there, turn into the Prothalis mix their sperm and eggs, and eventually the sporophyte grows, and that's what we see here, the golden-foot polypotie. Once it's established, it can crawl around the stem, can actually crawl and climb and branch and arch and live quite happily up in the boots of a cabbage palm. We've seen this picture before with the kind of erratically scattered sori across the underside of the golden-foot polypotie. There's your golden foot, the growing stem. The growing end of the stem is covered in these golden scales that are kind of like hairs, kind of like the rabbit's foot fern, same idea. The growing edge of the stem, where these individual leaves are going to grow out of, covered in these golden scales, looking like a rabbit's foot, giving it the name the golden-foot polypotie. We mentioned the resurrection fern before. You might be familiar with this one. This is the one that is classically pinnatifid, where it's not, where the fronds aren't divided into pinna. They're just very deeply lobed. You can see the reproductive structures underneath here. This is the one that can dry completely out, and when it's wet, produces this nice lush growth, grows as an epiphyte, which will be our subject next week on the 21st. We'll be looking at epiphytes exclusively, including this resurrection fern. Up there in the treetops, using its roots to hang on. It's not a parasite. It's not getting any moisture or food or nutrient or anything else from the tree that it's growing on. If it doesn't rain, the thing dries out. Bark doesn't really hold that much liquid, much water, so the plant dries out, and it's adapted to doing that. It can almost completely lose all of its water out of the leaves, curls up, but then when it rains, it can reabsorb that and flush back out. If you have a fern up in the high and dry, if you're in bright white sand, if you're surrounded by saw palm meadows and pine trees and you have a fern growing there, very likely to be the Bracken Fern. And if it is in a reproductive phase, you'll remember that the sporangia are produced around the edge of the pinnae. Look how weird those pinnae are shaped. These are lobed at the base, and then they have this one extremely long lobe, really weird, variable pinna shapes. Like some are stocking shaped, some are skeleton shaped. They're just all over the shop as far as the lobing of the pinna of the Bracken fern can form quite massive tangles, not much to compete with it. The stems are very, very deep underground. They're protected from fire. It's fire adapted, so the growing tip is way underground. It can also travel great distances. The stem can grow underground for great distances, and then it will send a leaf up maybe 20 feet that way. Therefore, not recommended. Not a Florida-friendly plant. It is Florida native, but is not friendly. It has the propensity to come up where you might not want it. We mentioned the mosquito fern early. The other floating fern, water spangles, another weed, another invasive plant. This was another curiosity. Like the climbing fern, a water fern, cool, let's grow it. Somebody grew it, it got into a water system, it became established, it spread. It's called water spangles. The fronds are actually upside down, and these hairs, you can see, if anybody has a cat, this is like what a cat tongue looks like, has the same texture, kind of abrasive. These hairs are shaped like egg beaters. They help keep the water off the surface of the leaves because they don't want to drown. They're already floating in water. But again, a very, very noxious weed, can grow very, very fast by division. This one has almost completely foregone spore reproduction. They just divide, and each plant can divide, and it becomes exponential growth. A single plant can cover a 40-acre lake in one summer. That's one plant. One summer, 40 acres. It's a problem. But that's a subject for another lecture on another day. The maiden ferns, a huge group of ferns, the maiden ferns. There's 1,000 species worldwide. We have 21 maiden ferns in North America. There are 16 different maiden ferns in Florida, but we've only got 3 in Pinellas. So this huge group only represented by 3 in Pinellas. So let's take a look at the 3 that we have. We have the Hottentot fern. It used to be called Polypterus interrupta. Recent DNA has put it into a different genus, but it's still a maiden fern. It's still one of the maiden ferns. It's still the Hottentot fern. It has, among the maiden ferns, they have this propensity to have a very widely triangular blade. So in outline, it's a very wide triangle, but the top maybe 1/5 or 1/6 of the entire frond is suddenly truncated. It's like it comes to an abrupt, it's got all this going for it, this nice wide, and then it just kind of gives up at the very end. And the maiden ferns, they kind of mash all of their little individual, what were individual pinnae, into just one big pinnatifid mess. With this, in this case, this fertile frond with a very distinctive arrangement of the sporangia. They're interrupted. It's not a continuous line around following the outline. They stop. There's a gap and another gap and another gap and another gap. That gives it this name, the interrupted fern. It's what gives it its scientific name. Some call it the interrupted fern. If you look at the way that the vein structure is, if you were to hold this frond up to the light, you can see between this lobe and this lobe, entire lobe, the lowest vein in this lobe and in this lobe. So this vein from this lobe, this vein from this lobe, they meet and they run together as a single unit up into this area called the sinus. It's diagnostic. If you need to know there's some information you can collect and look it up. Which one of those maiden ferns does that? Let's look it up. Then you'll know you were looking at the interrupted. The southern shield fern, again, one of the maiden ferns with the broadly triangular leaf outline that comes to this abrupt, acute point at the tip. The southern shield fern, it has veins from lobe to lobe that never meet. See, this lowest vein here and this lowest vein here, they just kind of look at each other from either side of the sinus. They never get to know each other. That's the southern shield fern. But the easiest way to recognize a southern shield fern or the widespread maiden fern are the white hairs underneath. You see, in different light, this is the same thing in different light. From below, from above, you can see all those white hairs. Very distinctive, very diagnostic of the widespread maiden fern, also called the southern shield fern. Apple green, very abundant, loves development, loves to come up in cracks around houses, quite adapted to human disturbance. On the other side, we have the marsh fern. This maiden fern looks very much like the others with that broad triangular frond that's truncated at the very tip. The only real way to diagnose this one is it growing in or very near to water, the marsh fern? And does it have, of all the maiden ferns, does it have the tuning fork branching on of the veins underneath each of these little lobes? That's two things to look for. Here it is in real life, those tuning fork branches of the veins. Forget meeting or not meeting, just being branched. Bifurcate is actually the word for it. Being bifurcate helps distinguish the marsh fern from the other maiden ferns. See, 3 maiden ferns, no problem. We saw the netted chain fern before, very pinnatifid. These leaflets aren't discrete. This blade is just very, very deeply lobed. Okay, those are the sterile fronds. This is the one that has the furl fronds that stand up very tall, very straight, to throw spores into the wind. This is one that's associated with very wet areas. It likes to have its feet at least seasonally flooded. The veins on the underside of the netted chain fern make a net, not a net, make a net. They're netted, so you can see each one of these little fully enclosed, encircled by veins. Those are called areoles, which gives it its name, areolata. Here it is again in separate and different lighting from above. You can see that the veins close in and make these discrete areas called areoles. The Virginia chain fern, another one of the chain ferns. This one can be very easily confused with the cinnamon fern, unless you see on the underside of this frond that's wide and green. If you see the sporangia, it can't be a cinnamon fern. Remember why? The cinnamon fern has just the cinnamon stick. When it's fertile, it has that other frond that makes the cinnamon stick. You're not going to find reproductive tissue on the underside of the sterile frond of the cinnamon fern because they're sterile. This fern, the Virginia chain fern, looks like that cinnamon fern, doesn't have the hairy armpits, does have reproductive structure underneath, and is very often kind of silvery on the underside. Sometimes it's quite striking just how white the underside of the Virginia chain fern can be. Also, you can see that the sporangia are lined up along the rachis and the central midvein of the individual little pinna. So you see a very thorough coverage of reproductive tissues, those sporangia. Now, ferns might have the reputation of being very, very weak. They need shade, they need water, they need this, they need that, but they're tough. 3 days after a fire, it was the Virginia chain fern that was first out of the ground. Fire moved through this area, fire adapted species. The grasses came back pretty fast, but it was the Virginia chain fern that was very first on the scene. They were going to jump up and get all the sunlight before everything else grew back. So folks, that is a quick look at the 15 species of ferns that are found here at Brooker Creek Preserve. Hope you come and see them. They make great photography subjects. They don't move. They don't talk back. Fun to photograph just after a rain, like we're about to have. We do hope that you'll come and visit us and our ferns at Brooker Creek Preserve. I want to thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. The lightning's getting ready to shut everything down, so it's just as well we've come to the end of our presentation. Let me just quick check to see if we have any. Are there any animals that eat ferns? Of course, yes. There are insects that eat ferns. Our mammals will chew on ferns. But so they're definitely part of the overall ecosystem, and they have been since before there were even animals. So they're today a part of the food chain. They always have been a part of the food chain as long as there's been one. Certain ferns, though, are capable of making, creating, just like any other plant, synthesizing substances that might make them slightly impalatable. So great question. Thank you very much for that. Do email me any questions, comments, complaints, concerns, ideas for future classes, webinars. We're going to continue to come to you on Wednesdays at 2 o'clock here at Brooker Creek Preserve. Find us on Facebook, Brooker Creek Preserve Environmental Education System. With that, I'll bid you good afternoon and thank you again for joining us today.